In the heart of West Africa, where the dust of conflict settles but the wounds remain, a nation stands at the crossroads of its future. Burkina Faso, a land long torn by political instability, finds itself caught between foreign powers and its own struggle for sovereignty. When a military coup shakes the country, Captain Ibrahim Traoré rises to power, promising a new dawn. But as alliances are formed and loyalties are tested, the true cost of power becomes clear. It was a cold, misty morning in Moscow as the government's flagship aircraft, an Il-96, prepared for takeoff. The heavy jet, painted in the sleek colors of the Russian government, sat on the tarmac, its engines humming as it awaited its orders. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. High-ranking officials from the Russian Ministry of Defense and intelligence agencies moved swiftly through the corridors, their steps purposeful, their expressions serious. President Vladimir Putin, though not physically present, had given his orders clearly. Transport Captain Ibrahim Traoré from Burkina Faso to Moscow, bring him to the negotiation table, ensure his loyalty, make him understand the stakes. The flight was not a simple diplomatic mission. It was a carefully calculated move in a much larger game, one that would soon reveal the hidden power struggles of the international stage. On board the Il-96, there was a quiet tension. The Russian military advisors, the crew, and the special security forces knew the stakes were high. Traoré's loyalty to Moscow was essential for the success of the Kremlin's long-term goals in Africa. The African continent had always been a chessboard for global powers, and Burkina Faso, strategically located in the heart of West Africa, had now become a critical piece. Russia's influence in Africa had been growing steadily in recent years, and with Burkina Faso facing a volatile internal situation, the Kremlin saw an opportunity to exert its power. Traoré, who had recently staged a coup and overthrown the previous government, was seen by Moscow as a potential ally, someone who could be guided into a new world order. But such alliances came with conditions, and Traoré had to be brought under Russia's influence before he could realize his full potential. As the aircraft climbed into the skies, escorted by 3 Su-57 stealth fighter jets, the tension in the cabin was palpable. These elite jets, symbols of Russia's military might, flew in a tight formation, their radar systems scanning the skies for any threat, though they knew that the only danger lay not in the clouds, but on the ground, unseen, invisible, and perhaps already waiting for them. In the midst of this military grandeur sat Colonel Antonov, the Kremlin's trusted liaison. He had been tasked with overseeing the mission, ensuring that the transfer of power and influence was executed flawlessly. Antonov's mission was simple: ensure that Captain Traoré understood that Moscow's interest in Burkina Faso was not just about military might or strategic alliances, but about shaping the future of a continent already fraught with political unrest. Burkina Faso is ripe for change, Antonov muttered to himself, as the cold wind from the cockpit howled in the distance. He knew the coup Traoré had led could either be the beginning of a new chapter for Burkina Faso, or it could spiral into chaos, drawing the country into an abyss where only the strong survived. The coming hours would determine which path the young leader would choose. The flight was long, the destination unclear even to those on board, for Traoré's arrival in Moscow was only the beginning of a much deeper strategy. Russia needed Traoré and Traoré needed Russia, but there were forces, both in Burkina Faso and across the globe, that would stop at nothing to keep them from becoming allies. As the Il-96 soared across the skies, the wheels of a grander conspiracy began to turn. Moscow had its eye on Burkina Faso, and it was only a matter of time before the world would understand the true nature of the game being played. As the Il-96 neared the skies over Ouagadougou, the atmosphere inside the aircraft shifted. The engine's roar had become a constant hum, a backdrop to the quiet discussions happening between Russian diplomats and military advisors. They knew the gravity of the task at hand, securing Burkina Faso's allegiance in exchange for influence and support. Colonel Antonov sat with his hands clasped tightly, staring out the window as the landscape below began to take shape. His thoughts were not just on the mission ahead, but on the many layers of strategy that had led to this moment. This was not a simple diplomatic visit. This was a move in a long, delicate game of power, one that Russia had been playing for years in Africa, particularly in regions where Western powers had begun to lose their grip. Burkina Faso, with its rich natural resources and strategic position, was now a prime target for the Russian Federation. The government of the United States and the European Union had been hesitant to act decisively in the region, leaving space for Russian influence to grow. But Moscow was not just interested in raw resources. It was a geopolitical maneuver, a carefully crafted strategy to counterbalance Western power on the African continent. As the aircraft touched down on the tarmac, the reality of the mission hit Antonov. The meeting with Captain Ibrahim Traoré was not just about presenting Russia's military strength. It was about establishing a long-term alliance that would keep Burkina Faso firmly within Moscow's sphere of influence. Traoré had risen to power through a military coup, just the kind of leader Russia wanted to back. It was a delicate situation, though. Traoré, a man in his early 40s, was not a man of many words. His actions spoke volumes. He was tough, pragmatic, and shrewd, qualities that had allowed him to take control of the country so quickly. His background as a military officer meant that he respected strength, and Russia, with its powerful military presence, was able to command his attention. As Colonel Antonov exited the aircraft, accompanied by his small entourage, the security detail was already in place, making sure that the meeting would proceed without incident. Traoré had insisted on a private meeting, no media, no cameras, no witnesses, a sign of the delicate nature of the alliance that was about to be formed. Antonov knew that this was not just a diplomatic exchange. It was an intricate game of trust, secrecy, and power. The two men, Traoré and Antonov, sat across from each other in a small, secure room within the presidential palace. The atmosphere was heavy with the weight of their respective missions. As the Russian delegation settled into their seats, Traoré spoke first. "You come to me at a time when my country is in crisis," he said, his voice calm but carrying an undeniable force. "Burkina Faso is at a crossroads. The old order is gone. What will your support bring to the table?" Antonov met his gaze with a measured response, his tone respectful but firm. "Captain Traoré, Russia is not here to intervene in your country's internal affairs. We are here to offer a partnership built on mutual benefit. What we seek is not to control Burkina Faso, but to support its rise as a true sovereign state. Our interests align. The West has abandoned you, but Russia sees potential." Traoré leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. He was calculating, assessing. "And what do you expect in return?" he asked. "You are not offering these things out of kindness." "Nothing in this world comes without a price," Antonov replied, his tone unwavering. "We seek access to resources and a strategic foothold in West Africa, but more importantly, we seek a long-term relationship with a nation that shares our values: sovereignty, power, and independence." The silence in the room was heavy, as both men weighed the conversation's implications. Traoré understood the stakes. The country had been racked with instability for years, and foreign intervention had already played a part in his rise. But as much as he understood Russia's motives, he also knew that the future of Burkina Faso rested in his hands, and his hands alone. "If I agree to this alliance," Traoré asked, his voice tinged with suspicion, "what guarantees do I have that Russia will not use me as a pawn, as it has done with so many other countries?" Antonov smiled slightly, sensing the underlying mistrust. "Captain, this is not about using you. It is about a partnership. Russia has no interest in controlling Burkina Faso. We want to see your nation prosper and be secure in its own right. In return, we ask for your cooperation on a range of strategic issues. Your military, your resources, your vote in international forums, all can work in our favor." The Russian diplomat paused before adding, "And of course, there is the matter of security. With the West faltering in its support, Russia can provide the security your people need. We have already deployed Su-57 stealth fighters to ensure your safety, should you need it. The mention of the stealth aircraft was not lost on Traore. He knew that the presence of such military power was both a gesture of support and a clear signal of Russia's commitment to his success. In that moment, Traore understood that this was not just a partnership. It was a strategic alliance that would either elevate Burkina Faso on the global stage or bind it to Russia in a way he could not yet fully comprehend. But there was one thing Traore knew for sure. He had no other choice. The winds of change were blowing, and if he were to navigate them, he needed an ally like Russia. "I accept," he said quietly, locking eyes with Antonov. "But know this, Colonel, Burkina Faso's future will be shaped by its people. You may offer your support, but my loyalty is to my country and my people will not be forgotten." Antonov nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Understood, Captain. Together, we will ensure that Burkina Faso's future is secured, for now and for the long term." The next morning, as the sun rose over the horizon, casting its golden light over the dusty streets of Ouagadougou, the atmosphere remained thick with anticipation. The deal had been struck, and the future of Burkina Faso in many ways now hinged on the alliance with Russia. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, while confident in his decision, could not shake the nagging thought in the back of his mind. What had he truly agreed to? It wasn't long before the first sign of Russia's military presence in Burkina Faso appeared in the form of 3 sleek Su-57 stealth fighter jets. They sliced through the sky above Ouagadougou with quiet precision, a stark reminder of the power now supporting Traoré's fledgling regime. The jets were not only a show of strength, they were a signal to anyone who dared challenge the new order. Russia's shadow had descended upon the country, and with it came an unmistakable promise of military protection. The Su-57, a symbol of Russia's most advanced technology, had been deployed with specific orders. They were to patrol the skies around Burkina Faso, keeping an eye on both internal and external threats. The stealth jets were equipped with sophisticated radar systems and weapons payloads, able to intercept any potential threats from the air or ground before they could even be detected. But there was more to their presence than just protection. It was a message to the West. Inside the presidential palace, Traoré stood at a window, looking up at the jets as they flew overhead. Their presence filled him with both awe and a deep sense of foreboding. He knew that the West would be watching closely, and while the jets provided him with unprecedented security, they also came at a steep cost. The stakes of his alliance with Russia were higher than he had anticipated. There would be no turning back now. "Captain, the jets are in position," a voice interrupted his thoughts. It was Zongo, his most trusted advisor and military strategist. "We have the support we need. The world is watching, but we've made our move." Traoré turned to face him, his expression unreadable. "And what of the people? They will see these jets and know what it means. It's not just security, it's power." Zongo nodded, understanding the weight of Traoré's words. "Yes, it is power, but it's also a message." But Traoré was no fool. He had played the game of power before, and he knew that such alliances were fraught with dangers. He understood that Russia would expect something in return, something far beyond the military assistance and support that had been promised. There was a price to be paid for their backing, and he was yet to fully comprehend what it would be. Meanwhile, as the jets soared through the skies, Major Diarra, Traoré's former comrade turned foe, was already planning his next move. The insurgents had been slowly losing ground, but the arrival of Russia's military might was a game-changer. Diarra's forces, though bolstered by external support, had yet to face the full weight of Russia's involvement. With the stealth jets in the air and the Russian military operating from behind the scenes, Diarra knew that his window of opportunity was closing fast. Diarra had always believed in his military superiority, but he could not ignore the power of Russia's influence. The new order had arrived, and with it, the unmistakable scent of betrayal. He had once fought alongside Traoré, believing in his vision for Burkina Faso, but now, As the Russian jets patrolled the skies, Traore understood that his old friend had made a deal with a power far beyond his comprehension. Traore has made his choice, Traore muttered to himself as he paced in his makeshift command center, his brow furrowed with frustration. But he doesn't know the cost of that choice. The people will never accept Russia's influence in our country. We will not let them take everything. Traore knew the battle was far from over. His forces were still scattered, but they had the support of those who had once been loyal to the old regime. The insurgents, though losing ground, had not yet been fully defeated. And now, with the looming threat of Russian military might, Traore was more determined than ever to finish what he had started. The coming days would be a test for both Traore and Traore. The balance of power in Burkina Faso was shifting once again, and neither side could afford to falter. As the Su-57s continued their silent patrol, the final stage of the conflict was about to unfold. It would be a battle for the future of the country, a battle between those who sought to bring Burkina Faso into Russia's sphere of influence, and those who were determined to keep the country's fate in its own hands. The days following the arrival of the Russian Su-57 jets were filled with political turbulence. The presence of such advanced military technology was both a show of strength and a harbinger of the challenges to come. As Traore's government moved to solidify its control, the streets of Ouagadougou began to pulse with anxiety, a mixture of fear and hope. The jets overhead signified an undeniable shift in the balance of power, not just within Burkina Faso, but in the entire region. While Traore remained secure in his position, the external pressure was mounting. The Western powers, already concerned about the influence of Russia in Africa, began to react. Diplomatic channels buzzed with activity as embassies scrambled to issue statements and prepare for potential fallout. Traore's alliance with Russia, while crucial for his survival, was creating new alliances and enemies far beyond his control. In the shadows of these political maneuverings, Traore met with his closest advisors in a secure room, away from prying eyes. Zongo, as always, stood by his side, his face drawn with the weight of the situation. The two men knew that their alliance with Russia had saved them from immediate danger, but it came with a heavy price. What exactly was Russia's long-term plan for Burkina Faso? And more importantly, what did it mean for their sovereignty? "Do we truly understand the cost of this alliance?" Zongo asked, his voice low. "Russia did not come here out of kindness. They expect something in return, and I fear that they will not be content with just military cooperation and economic deals. They are playing a much longer game." Traore nodded, his brow furrowed. "I know, but without their support, we would have been overrun by now. Traore's forces were growing stronger, and the West has left us to fend for ourselves. Russia may want more than we bargained for, but in this moment, we have little choice." Zongo's gaze shifted to the window, where the Russian jets could still be seen soaring above the city. The sight of them made him uneasy, a constant reminder of the powerful ally watching over them. He had seen the cold, calculated moves of Moscow before, and he knew that they would not hesitate to use Burkina Faso as a stepping stone to further their own interests in Africa. "They'll expect us to play by their rules," Zongo continued, his voice tinged with uncertainty. The room grew heavy with the silence that followed. Traore knew that Zongo was right. Russia's support had come with strings attached, and the strings were already beginning to tighten. Moscow had made its intentions clear. They didn't want a puppet leader. They wanted a loyal partner, someone who would help them secure resources and strategic advantages in the region. The question now was whether Traore could fulfill those expectations without sacrificing the independence he had fought so hard to protect. Meanwhile, Traore, ever the tactician, was not content to let Russia's influence go unchecked. His insurgent forces had regrouped and were rapidly gaining ground in the northern provinces. Though Traore's government had been bolstered by Russia's military might, the insurgency was still formidable. Traore's forces, fueled by discontent and external support, were determined to overthrow the new regime. Traore's approach was a far cry from brute force. He understood the psychology of power, the fragility of leadership, and the power of disinformation. His network of sympathizers within the military and government had begun to spread propaganda, sowing distrust and fear among the populace. Traore knew that the best way to weaken Traore wasn't just through military action, it was by undermining the confidence of the people. Through anonymous broadcasts and underground pamphlets, Traore's supporters painted a picture of a country under foreign control, a nation that had sold its soul to Russia. The people of Burkina Faso, already weary from years of instability, were now faced with a choice. Would they accept Russia's hand in their nation's future, or would they rise up against Traore, rejecting foreign intervention and reclaiming their independence? The media, both independent and government-controlled, began to reflect the growing divide. Traore's government tried to suppress the dissenting voices, but the insurgency's propaganda machine was swift and far-reaching. It wasn't long before protests erupted across Ouagadougou and other major cities. The people, who had once seen Traore as a symbol of hope, were now questioning his decisions. Could they trust a leader who had so quickly turned to a foreign power for help? For Traore, the pressure was mounting. The jets above, once a symbol of strength, were now a constant reminder of the cost of his decision. As he stood before his people, giving speeches about national unity and the promise of a better future, the whispers of betrayal grew louder. The insurgency, though weakened, was still a threat, and now the people themselves seemed divided. But Traore was not one to back down easily. He had fought for power once before, and he would do it again if necessary. He would have to confront the insurgency head-on while also navigating the complex relationship with Moscow. There was no room for failure, not now. Burkina Faso's future, his own legacy, depended on his ability to balance the demands of both his people and his foreign ally. The political landscape of Burkina Faso had shifted dramatically in the weeks following the alliance with Russia. While Traore's regime had been bolstered by Moscow's military presence, it was clear that the true price of this support was not only measured in military might, but also in the gradual erosion of the nation's independence. The divide between the government and the people continued to deepen. The protests that had begun as expressions of discontent with Traore's alliance with Russia had evolved into full-blown riots. The streets were filled with angry citizens, many of whom had once supported the captain's rise to power. Now, with the country's sovereignty seemingly sold to a foreign power, their trust in Traore had begun to crumble. Zongo, still by Traore's side, observed the growing unrest with a mixture of frustration and fear. They had expected some resistance, but not on this scale. The power of the insurgents, once thought to be waning, was being revitalized by the growing disillusionment among the people. And Traore's forces, now emboldened by the protests and fueled by external support, were making their move. "Traore," Zongo said one morning, his voice strained, "we cannot continue to ignore the voices of the people. Russia may have helped us secure our position, but we are losing control of the nation. If we don't act soon, we will have nothing left." Traore sat in silence, his hands clasped tightly together. His mind was racing, torn between the promises made to Moscow and the rising tide of opposition from within his own country. He knew that the insurgency had already claimed several key northern provinces, and now, with the people questioning his leadership, the capital was at risk of falling into chaos. "Is it worth it, Zongo?" Traore finally spoke, his voice thick with the weight of his dilemma. "All the power, the military might." Zongo met his gaze, his expression hardening. "It was never about trust, Captain, it was about survival. You know as well as I do that without Russia's support, we would have fallen to Traore long ago. But now the real battle isn't against insurgents, it's against the very people we swore to protect." Traore stood, walking over to the window of the presidential palace. The city lay sprawled beneath him, the smoke from the distant protests rising into the air like a dark omen. "We've become pawns, Zongo," Traore muttered. "The people no longer see us as their leaders, they see us as puppets in a game they don't understand. And they're right. I've played this game too long and now I've lost them. But Zongo, ever the strategist, refused to let Traore succumb to despair. We still have one weapon left, he said. We have the people who remain loyal to us, the military and the factions within the capital. And we have Russia's military backing, whether we like it or not. If we show strength, if we take back control, if we end this insurgency once and for all, we might still salvage this. Traore turned to face him, a look of determination flashing in his eyes. We can't afford to fail, Zongo replied bluntly. If we lose their support, it will all fall apart. But if we can crush Traore and his insurgents and prove to the people that we can still lead, then we can hold on to power. But we need to move fast. Russia's patience will not last forever. The clock was ticking. With the Russian jets still patrolling the skies and Moscow's support hanging in the balance, Traore had to make a choice. The battle for Burkina Faso's future was no longer about military strategy alone. It was about reconciling the demands of a nation divided between loyalty to him and fear of foreign domination. The following days were a whirlwind of military strategy and political maneuvering. Traore made the difficult decision to strike back at the insurgents in a bold, all-out assault. He called upon the loyal factions of the military to stand united, preparing for an assault on the insurgent stronghold in the northern provinces. The air was thick with anticipation. This would be their chance to end the insurgency once and for all. As the military forces, backed by Russian air support, began their advance, the first signs of a coordinated attack began to emerge. Traore's forces, though well-organized and supported by external agents, were caught off guard by the ferocity of Traore's offensive. The Russian Su-57 soared overhead, targeting insurgent positions with pinpoint precision, while the ground forces moved swiftly to reclaim key territories. But as the tide began to turn in favor of Traore's forces, something unexpected happened. The people, those who had once protested his alliance with Russia, began to rally behind the military. The protests turned into support for the government's military actions, as citizens saw the insurgency as a threat to their very survival. The tide was shifting once again. Yet, as Traore watched the battle unfold, he couldn't shake the feeling that the true cost of victory was still to be paid. The people's support had returned, but at what cost? The military had regained control, but the scars of the conflict would remain for years to come. With the insurgency weakening, Traore knew that this was only a temporary victory. The real challenge lay ahead, rebuilding a nation divided, reclaiming the trust of his people, and understanding the true cost of his alliance with Russia. The dust from the fierce battle had barely settled when the first wave of realization began to hit. Burkina Faso had fought hard, and the insurgency led by Traore had been crushed, at least for now. The Russian jets, whose presence had been both a beacon of power and a source of suspicion, continued to patrol the skies, a constant reminder of the geopolitical shift that had reshaped the country. For Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the battle had been won, but the war for the future of the country had only just begun. As the military forces regrouped, there was no celebratory air, no sense of triumph. The conflict had left deep scars, not just in the infrastructure of the country, but within its very soul. The morning after the final battle, Traore stood on the balcony of the presidential palace, looking out over the capital. The city was alive with the sounds of rebuilding, construction crews working to repair the damage, soldiers securing key positions, and civilians trying to return to normal life after weeks of chaos. But beneath the surface, there was an undercurrent of unease. Traore knew that the unity he had gained through military force was temporary. Zongo, ever vigilant, approached him as he stood lost in thought. "The people are rebuilding, but they are still wary," Zongo said quietly. "They've seen the jets, the foreign military presence, and they know that the cost of this victory goes beyond what we can promise them." Traore nodded, his face etched with concern. "I know, Zongo, We've secured the country, but I fear we've lost something much more important, the trust of the people. The West may have abandoned us, but it was Russia that we needed to save us. It was our own people." Zongo watched his leader, sensing the depth of his struggle. "You did what was necessary. We could have lost everything. But now that we've reclaimed the country, the real work begins. You need to rebuild not just the cities, but the trust that has been fractured. The people need to know that they have a say in their future." As the weeks passed, Traore worked tirelessly to stabilize the country. The military, still loyal but increasingly weary, was stationed throughout the capital and key regions. Traore began to implement reforms, promising to reintroduce civilian governance and limit the influence of foreign powers in the country's daily affairs. But with every step he took to reassure the people, another complication arose. Russia, despite its promises of partnership, began to assert its expectations. Diplomatic envoys arrived, and discussions shifted from military support to economic interests. Russia wanted access to Burkina Faso's mineral resources, and with its military presence entrenched, it had leverage over the new government. One evening, as Traore sat with his advisors, the reality of his situation hit him harder than ever. His country was secure, but at what cost? The insurgency had been crushed, but the true battle was for the people's hearts and minds. They had suffered for too long, first under the rule of Damiba, then through the coup, and now under the shadow of Russian influence. How could he lead them to a future that was both independent and prosperous when they no longer believed in the promises of their leaders? The following day, Traore made an unprecedented decision. He called for a national referendum, asking the people of Burkina Faso to decide the country's future. Would they continue to rely on Russian support, or would they seek a new path, one that was free from external control? The referendum was a gamble, a risky move that could either solidify his position or lead to his downfall. But it was the only way to heal the wounds that had been inflicted upon the nation. As the referendum date neared, tensions in the capital grew. Supporters of Traore, many of whom had initially backed his alliance with Russia, were nervous. They feared that a decision to turn away from Moscow might lead to further instability, especially with insurgents still lurking in the shadows. Meanwhile, the opposition, which had never fully accepted the coup, rallied against the growing foreign influence in Burkina Faso, calling for a complete break from Russia and a return to true independence. When the referendum finally took place, the nation held its breath. The streets were quiet as ballots were cast, the tension in the air thick with the uncertainty of what the outcome would bring. Would Burkina Faso continue down the path Traore had set, with Russia as an ally, or would the people demand a new future, free from foreign domination? The results were a shocking blow to Traore's government. The majority of the people voted to sever ties with Russia and reclaim full control over their country's destiny. The vote was a resounding statement. Burkina Faso wanted to chart its own course, free from the influence of foreign powers, and Traore was forced to face the truth. The cost of his alliance with Russia had been too high. Traore stood in the presidential palace, staring at the results of the referendum. His dreams of a strong, independent Burkina Faso had been shattered by the very people he had fought to protect. But in that moment, he knew that the country had spoken, and he would have to answer. As the dust settled from the referendum, one thing was clear. The battle for Burkina Faso's soul was far from over. But Traore, though defeated by his own people's demands, would not give up. He would rebuild the nation, even if it meant doing so without the foreign support he had once relied upon. The struggle for true sovereignty was just beginning. The referendum results were both a triumph and a devastation for Captain Ibrahim Traoré. The people of Burkina Faso had spoken, and their choice was clear. They wanted their country to stand on its own 2 feet, free from foreign control, free from the shadow of Russia. The decision, though a victory for their independence, was a bitter pill for Traoré to swallow. He had placed his faith in Russia, believing that their military support was the key to securing Burkina Faso's future. Traore's heart sank as he read the final tally. The result was decisive. Nearly 65% of the population had voted to sever ties with Russia and reclaim control over their nation's destiny. The remaining 35% were those who had once seen Russia's intervention as a lifeline. It was clear that the country was deeply divided, but the overwhelming majority had made their voices heard. Now Traore stood at a crossroads. His vision for Burkina Faso had been shaped by his alliance with Russia, but the people had rejected that path. The message was undeniable. Their sovereignty was more important than any external support. They had suffered enough, first under the tyranny of the old regime, and then under the shadow of foreign intervention. The military, which had once been united under Traore's banner, now found itself at odds. Some generals, loyal to Traore, saw the referendum as a temporary setback, one that could be reversed with time. But others, especially those who had seen the devastation of foreign influence firsthand, supported the people's decision. The internal divisions within the military were growing, and the once strong unity of Traore's forces was beginning to fray. Zongo, ever the strategist, understood the precariousness of the situation. He had stood by Traore's side through thick and thin, but now, with the referendum result, he knew that their hold on power was slipping. The people had demanded independence, but achieving that independence would not be easy. "We cannot afford to let this divide us," Zongo said, his voice tinged with urgency. "We need to show the people that we are still their leaders, that we are still committed to their future." Traore nodded, his eyes distant. "But how? The people have rejected Russia, and without their support we are vulnerable. We cannot fight a war of propaganda and military might forever. If we are to survive this, we need to rebuild from the ground up." Zongo paced in front of the window, deep in thought. "We need to prove to the people that their choice was the right one. We need to rebuild trust, show them that we can lead without foreign help. If we don't regain their support, the insurgents will come for us again, and the West will only see us as weak, divided." The next few days were filled with strategic planning and tense deliberations. Traore knew that he couldn't afford another misstep. He had to act decisively, quickly, and with unwavering resolve. His government was hanging by a thread, and the threat of rebellion was real. The insurgency, though weakened, was still a force to be reckoned with, and Traore, once his ally, was now more determined than ever to overthrow him. But it wasn't just the insurgents Traore had to worry about. The pressure from Russia, though not as overt as before, was still palpable. Moscow had supported him when he needed it most, but now that the referendum had severed ties, they would not take this lightly. The threat of diplomatic isolation loomed over him, and Traore knew that the Kremlin would be watching closely, waiting for any sign of weakness. In a rare moment of reflection, Traore sat alone in his office, staring out at the city that had been both his battleground and his refuge. The weight of his decisions, both past and present, hung heavily on his shoulders. He had fought for Burkina Faso's independence, but now, the very independence he had sought was slipping away. How could he reconcile the promises he had made to the people with the reality of the political landscape? The answer, Traore realized, lay not in military force or political alliances, but in the people themselves. The referendum had been their call to arms. The people had spoken, and it was his duty to listen, to lead them, not with the promise of foreign support, but with the strength of Burkina Faso's own will. Traore made the decision then and there. He would no longer rely on Russia. The time had come to fully embrace Burkina Faso's independence, to prove that the country could stand on its own. He would rebuild the military, the economy, and the government from the ground up. It would be a difficult, painful process, but it was the only way forward. He stood up, his decision made. The people had shown him their trust. Now it was time to show them that their faith was not misplaced. He would lead Burkina Faso through the storm, and together they would rebuild their nation, stronger, united, and truly independent. The days after the referendum were among the hardest Traore had faced. The euphoria of victory quickly faded, replaced by the stark reality of a nation divided. Despite the overwhelming support for independence, there were still those who questioned whether Burkina Faso could truly stand on its own. The military was fractured, the economy in shambles, and the people, once hopeful, were now skeptical. Traore knew that his next moves would define the future of Burkina Faso. If he was to rebuild the nation, he had to prove that their decision to sever ties with Russia was not a mistake. It was not just about military power or political maneuvering. It was about restoring the trust of the people, showing them that Burkina Faso could thrive without relying on foreign powers. Zongo, ever the strategist, knew that this was the final chance for Traore's leadership to be solidified. We need to restore order and rebuild the military. The insurgents are still a threat, and while the people have spoken, they need to see us act decisively. If we don't act swiftly, there will be no government left to rebuild. Traore agreed, but he also knew that military strength alone wouldn't be enough. The real challenge lay in convincing the people that their sovereignty was worth the fight. The economic devastation from the coup, the closure of borders, and the internal divisions had taken their toll. Burkina Faso needed a new direction, a path forward that was rooted in its own strength. The first step was to secure the capital and key regions still under the threat of insurgents. With the support of loyal military factions, Traore launched a series of swift strikes to reclaim areas controlled by Diarra's forces. It was a brutal, tactical campaign, executed with precision and ruthless efficiency. The insurgents, though well organized, were no match for the full force of Traore's military, backed by those loyal to him and his government. But victory on the battlefield was only the beginning. Traore knew that to truly win the people's trust, he had to address the root causes of the unrest. It wasn't just about military strength. It was about governance, accountability, and economic revival. The people needed jobs, stability, and a future they could believe in. To that end, Traore introduced a series of sweeping reforms, focused on the most pressing issues facing the nation: food security, infrastructure, and education. The government promised to rebuild key infrastructure projects, focusing on roads, hospitals, and schools, areas that had been neglected for far too long. The reforms were ambitious, and many questioned whether they could be implemented in such a short time. But Traore was determined to show the people that Burkina Faso could thrive on its own terms. He wasn't just the president, he was their leader, and it was time for the people to see that they had a future in their own hands. The international community watched closely as Traore's government took shape. Western powers, particularly the United States and the European Union, had been wary of his alliance with Russia, but now they were forced to reconsider their position. If Burkina Faso could stabilize itself without the help of foreign powers, it would send a strong message to other nations in Africa that they too could chart their own course. But Russia, though officially on the sidelines, was still a looming presence. Traore knew that Moscow was not content with being ignored. The Kremlin's interests in Africa were vast, and its influence in Burkina Faso had not disappeared overnight. Behind closed doors, Russian diplomats continued to push for favorable deals, hoping to maintain a foothold in the country. Traore had made a promise to his people, but he could not afford to alienate Russia entirely. In the midst of all this, Diarra's insurgency was far from defeated. Though the military had reclaimed key territories, Diarra's forces were still scattered, operating in the shadows, waiting for their chance to strike again. Traore knew that the insurgency had been weakened, but it had not been eradicated. The battle for Burkina Faso's soul was far from over. One night, as Traore sat alone in his office, contemplating the enormity of the task ahead, Zongo entered. His expression was grim, but there was a sense of urgency in his step. "We've received intelligence," Zongo said. "Diarra's forces are regrouping. They have support from external sources, sources that could destabilize everything we've worked for." Traore looked up, his eyes steely with determination. "We knew this day would come. We've reclaimed the country's heart, but now we must protect it. Zongo nodded, a somber expression on his face. We'll need to act quickly and decisively. Traoré is not just a military threat. He's a symbol of everything that the people rejected. If we don't strike hard now, the insurgency will find its way back, stronger than before. The moment had arrived. Burkina Faso's future was on the line. Traoré had fought for survival, but now he had to fight for his people's trust. The next move would determine whether the nation could continue its fight for sovereignty, or whether it would fall back into the hands of those who sought to control it from the outside. The struggle was not over. It had just begun. The following morning, the first wave of attacks began. Traoré's military, reinforced by loyal factions and backed by Russian military assets, launched a coordinated offensive against Traoré's stronghold in Koudougou. The strategy was brutal and swift. No more half measures, no more waiting for the insurgents to strike first. Traoré had made it clear. The insurgency would be eradicated, and Burkina Faso would emerge victorious. The Russian Su-57 jets flew overhead, their sleek forms cutting through the sky like predators on the hunt. They provided air support, striking insurgent positions with precision and overwhelming firepower. The sound of the jets' engines was deafening as they tore through the air, a constant reminder of Russia's presence and the stakes of the battle. On the ground, the infantry pushed forward relentlessly, engaging in street-by-street combat. The insurgents, though entrenched in the region, were unprepared for the speed and force of the attack. Traoré's forces were spread thin, unable to match the firepower and coordination of the government's military. For the first time, the insurgents were on the back foot, retreating into the rugged terrain of the northern provinces. Traoré, though still commanding a portion of the rebel forces, could see that the battle was slipping from his grasp. His military had grown stronger over time, but it lacked the unified leadership and strategic resources that Traoré now commanded. His forces, scattered and disjointed, were no match for the full force of the government's military, backed by both loyalists and Russian air superiority. In the midst of the offensive, a disturbing report reached Traoré. A high-ranking officer in his ranks, someone he had trusted, had been found working covertly with the insurgents. The officer, Colonel Bamba, had been a key strategist for Traoré's government and had helped plan the military's assault on the insurgents. But now, he was discovered to have been feeding intelligence to Traoré's forces. The news hit Traoré like a punch to the gut. His trust in his own military was beginning to crumble, and the sense of betrayal was personal. Colonel Bamba had been his ally for years, someone who had fought alongside him in the early days of the coup. The officer's motives were unclear, but the damage was done. The insurgents had been tipped off, and the battle was no longer as straightforward as it had seemed. Bamba was one of our own, Traoré said, his voice heavy with disappointment. How could he betray us like this? How many more are out there? Zongo's face was hard as stone. We cannot afford to dwell on this. We need to focus on the mission at hand. We've come too far to let betrayal derail us now. The people are counting on us. Traoré knew Zongo was right. The country was on the brink. A single misstep could send Burkina Faso back into chaos, and the insurgents would not hesitate to take advantage of any weakness. He made the painful decision to execute Colonel Bamba as a symbol of the government's resolve. A leader who betrayed his people would not be allowed to survive. The message was clear: betrayal would not be tolerated. With the insurgents in full retreat and the betrayal dealt with, Traoré's forces pressed forward. The final battle for Koudougou was fierce, but it was clear that the insurgents had lost their momentum. Traoré, once a leader of a growing revolution, now found himself isolated. The people were no longer behind him. The insurgency had been dealt a heavy blow, and Traoré's forces were scattered. In a last-ditch effort to reclaim the country, Traoré attempted to rally his forces for one final push. But it was too late. His followers, disillusioned and defeated, turned on him. The leader who had once been seen as the hope of a fractured nation was now a pariah, his power broken. As Traore was captured by government forces, Traore stood on the balcony of the presidential palace, overlooking the city he had fought so hard to protect. The battle had been won, but the true fight was just beginning. Burkina Faso had survived, but the road to rebuilding would be long and fraught with challenges. Yet, for the first time in months, there was hope. The people had made their choice, and the country would rise again, stronger, united, and truly free. The final days of the conflict were marked by a haunting silence, broken only by the sounds of military operations and the occasional gunshot. Burkina Faso had weathered its worst storm in decades, and now, as the insurgency's last remnants were dismantled, the country stood on the precipice of a new era. But Traore, despite the victory, knew that this was not the end. Rather, it was the beginning of a long and difficult journey to heal the wounds of war and rebuild a fractured nation. As Traore was brought to justice, his forces scattered and leaderless, the streets of Ouagadougou remained cautiously optimistic. The once feared insurgents had been crushed, but the scars left by the conflict would remain for years to come. The country was divided, and the people, while grateful for their survival, were skeptical of what the future held. The referendum had shown that they wanted independence, but now it was time for Traore to prove that he could lead them to a better future. In the aftermath of the battle, Traore addressed the nation, his voice filled with the weight of both victory and responsibility. "Burkina Faso," he began, standing before a crowd gathered in the capital, "we have fought for our sovereignty, for our independence. We have faced our darkest days and emerged victorious. But this victory is not just for us. It is for our children, our future, and the generations to come. The struggle for our nation's soul is not over, but I stand here today, not as a leader, but as a servant of the people." His words, though inspiring, were met with both cheers and skepticism. People wanted to believe in the promise of a brighter future, but they had been betrayed too many times before. The political, economic, and social divisions that had plagued the country for years could not be fixed with words alone. Traore understood that his next steps would be the most crucial of his leadership. Traore wasted no time in setting up a new government, one that was more inclusive and transparent than any before it. The military, though still crucial to the country's defense, would no longer hold unchecked power. Civilian leaders were brought in to handle crucial aspects of governance, including education, healthcare, and infrastructure. For the first time in decades, the people of Burkina Faso began to feel a sense of ownership over their future. However, Traore knew that the path to reconciliation would be long and fraught with challenges. The insurgents, though defeated, still had loyal supporters, and the scars of the conflict were deep. The divide between the urban elite and the rural poor remained a constant issue, and distrust between different factions within the military continued to simmer beneath the surface. To heal the rifts, Traore initiated a national dialogue, inviting representatives from all sectors of society to come together and discuss the country's future. The government promised to implement policies that would address the root causes of the unrest: poverty, corruption, and inequality. It was an ambitious plan, but Traore had no choice. He knew that without addressing these issues, Burkina Faso would never be able to truly recover. As part of the national reconciliation effort, Traore also promised to establish a Truth and Justice Commission, aimed at uncovering the full extent of the corruption that had plagued the country for years. The commission would investigate the actions of the previous regime, as well as the role of foreign powers in destabilizing the country. The goal was not to punish, but to bring healing and accountability to a broken nation. Slowly, the wounds of the past began to heal. While there were still pockets of resistance, the majority of the population began to see that their future was tied to the success of their country, not to the promises of foreign powers. The economy, though battered by years of instability, began to show signs of recovery. International partners, wary at first, began to see that Burkina Faso was once again on the path to becoming a stable, self-sufficient nation. As the months passed, Traore's leadership was tested time and time again. There were setbacks, economic hardships, political rivalries, and occasional insurgent flare-ups, but the resilience of the people kept the nation moving forward. The hope that had seemed so distant in the aftermath of the coup was slowly becoming a reality. In the final days of his first year in office, Traore stood before the people once again. This time, there was no speech of military victory or calls to arms. Instead, he spoke of hope, of rebuilding, and of unity. "We are not just survivors," Traore said, his voice steady. "We are builders. We are creators of a new Burkina Faso, one that will stand on its own, strong and united. The world may have doubted us, but we have proven that we can overcome anything. This is just the beginning." Burkina Faso, though scarred, had emerged from its trials stronger than ever. The path to sovereignty had been hard won, and the price had been steep. But in the end, the country had chosen its own destiny. With Traore at the helm, Burkina Faso began to rebuild, not just its cities and infrastructure, but its identity. The country would never forget the struggles of the past, but they would also remember that in their darkest hour, they had found strength in themselves. Burkina Faso was no longer just a nation. It was a symbol of resilience, independence, and hope for the future. And as the sun set over the capital, the people of Burkina Faso knew that the future was theirs to shape. After the dust has settled, the battles fought, and the power struggles won and lost, one truth remains. Burkina Faso is a nation reborn. Its people, tested by hardship and war, have emerged stronger than ever, ready to shape their own destiny. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, once a figure of uncertainty, now stands as the leader of a country that has reclaimed its independence, not just from foreign powers, but from the forces of division that sought to tear it apart.